Hello everyone, today we talk about the dismantlement of the Gracchi legislation through Appian mostly and dealing essentially with the broader picture. I recently made a video about Tiberius, Sempronius Gracchus. We still have to talk about Caius. We really have to get more thoroughly into the Gracchi reforms, their period. We made multiple videos about 2nd century BC Roman politics, more than warfare or anything more evenemential in nature. We mostly looked at social history and, as you know, the so-called recruitment crisis, the failed Gracchi reforms, at least the essentially dismantled Gracchi reforms, are one of the most important turning points in the history of the so-called Republic, as they basically, with the violation of the tribunicial sacrosanctitas, brought to the agony of the Republic. Arguably, the necrosis of the same occurred under Sulla, and then, of course, we'll talk more about the 1st century BC. I plan at some point, not too quickly, but to expand Roman history and warfare content from the cycle, because I realized that although we made really a lot of Roman history videos, as a whole they do not match, not just, for example, the medieval content, but say that there is still so much to do to frame Roman civilization that is so useful, in fact, also for the rest of our content, that we really must accelerate in that direction. Probably this year, different, let's say, factors, hopefully assisting, will literally expand into something more thorough, especially about the Punic Wars. From a strictly military point of view, we will surely delve into the Middle Republican Roman army, the genesis of manipular tactics, and more. I really just need to, I say it bluntly, I need mostly to create some adequate art, because there is basically no available, copyright-wise, neat picture of, especially, I don't know, Astati, Principes, Triari, Veritas, Equites, and so on. So we're covered for the entire late Republic. I just recently made some content about Caesar that displayed, in fact, actually pretty consistent, not optimal, but still satisfactory amount of such imagery. Unfortunately, for some topics online, you can find so much that you can't use for, for YouTube, like with commercial licenses. Fortunately, for the Middle Ages, we do not have this great deal of a problem. But at some point, you have to create art for yourself, because some very important periods in history are not really represented in art to the point of adequately covering, say, a content like this that is also visual in form. In any case, we know what the Gracchi period had been. Today we talk about the immediate aftermath of that, the dismantlement of the Gracchi reforms. So the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius, Tribune in 133 BC, and Gaius, Tribune in 123-122, were Roman reformers who sought to address land inequality by redistributing public land, the ager publicus, to the poor. I don't think we have to specifically repeat, for example, like how the Romans established this amount of land through their conquest that could be directly occupied essentially by every Roman citizen with their own means, paying just a small fee, a symbolical one, and in this sense infiltrating in the territories of those peoples that had been crushed by Rome. Since there hadn't been too many regulations up to this point, there wasn't probably a massive Roman state, like as you can see, I don't know, in late antiquity. The Romans were a very primitive people up to this point, expanding with enormous rapidity, mostly through their moral, military means, and simply leading to this form of settlement, of colonization, and political territorial reorganization of the conquered peoples. As a consequence, however, there weren't enough checks and balances, and the more affluent Romans managed to take over the largest amount of land. In theory, the ager publicus could be simply taken back from the state, but in practice, the people who occupied this land at large, with their greater private means, in fact, to control it and to organize it in a latifundium, run by, for example, the local administrators, but through the labor force of the slaves of war, the Roman conquests of the last centuries, was really pressuring the sort of medium and small land owners that were not really safeguarded by the abuses of the most powerful. There is all an historiographical debate on whether this led, for example, to a true, for example, military crisis. It's been observed that the Romans didn't really have at this point any demographic issue. They had basically the manpower necessary to maintain their Mediterranean empire. However, I would stress that politically wise, the situation that essentially impoverished those citizen soldiers and peasant soldiers, in the sense that in theory would have had to contribute privately to their own military expenses, at least in part, was leading to really a moral fracture within the system, whereby the average peasant was not just ever more pressured and impoverished by the circumstances, but in this sense not really seeing the traditional military service as a viable mean to increase his status. As long as Rome had conquered Italy, it had been relatively easy for many Romans to resettle as military colonists in order to simply profit from the Roman conquest through a stable, say, fair market of landed assets. At this point, instead, there wasn't such a thing. Like, military service was mostly directed abroad, overseas, in lands that Rome at this point did not even have properly the full will to completely take over. Think about Spain, that is basically this quasi-Vietnam, except Rome eventually won. But on the long run, as far as this continuous draining of manpower to, in fact, basically barely expanding into the barren hinterland, was pretty savage. And so there is an enormous, as you know, political paralysis that is reflected in the quality of the Roman army, that again was always there, but that was not so motivated as before to keep on expanding. There wasn't much of an interest from the side of the establishment to create, for example, new colonies, to give new land abroad, to, in this sense, expand the provincial aristocracy, just to try to maintain control. Mostly in Italy, this had been one of the greater problems that you can see from the times of Quintus Fabius Maximus and Publius Cornelius Scipio. We talked about this also in the video about the Roman gravitas versus luxuria, or the trial to the Scipiones one. And to make the long story short, there had been a point in which the Roman consuls had literally go for in the countryside to hunt for Roman levies, and at some point the plebeian tribunes had stopped physically consuls from deporting, to basically forcefully recruit these peoples that by that point did not really even have the means to sustain themselves. The Roman army was changing, was becoming actually more reliant on a public form of supply. I recently made a video about the Marian reform. That is something that mostly came into being. It was formalized by Marius from a legal point of view, but that had already reflected this transition from essentially a militia to a professional system that, however, required a much more neatly identifiable institution of reference, such as a permanent army or a fully, at least a subcontracted system of arms and armor production supply. The Gracchi, descending also from one of the greatest gentes of patrician gentes in Rome, such as the gens Cornelia from their mother's side, were very well aware of the political and social inequalities of the system. We don't have the time now to describe everything in detail, how the voting mechanism was connected with not just with the actual power wielded politically, but with the same landed districts and more. In any case, Tiberius had essentially passed a law as plebeian tribune, where I have a video incoming about the Concordia Ordinum. Right, so when the Gracchi had been murdered, the sacrosanctitas of the tribunes had been violated to the point of basically disintegrating any glue that had kept the res publica together, institutionally wise, for centuries. So naturally, this was a very different time from the one in the clashes between patricians and plebeians. The Senate was, displaying, of course, people coming from both backgrounds, and just it was mostly the establishment had substantially detached itself from the larger masses of the Roman citizenry. But it was understood that this broader dynamic was not particularly helpful, and so the Gracchi had believed with their reforms to try to stem the decline, this collapse. There are many reasons for this that correspond also to different perspectives on Roman political institutional history of the previous generations. We're not going to make that, because this is a premise to a premise. So basically, Tiberius passed a law limiting land holdings and redistributing access to landless citizens, but he was murdered by a senatorial mob in 133 for bypassing traditional political norms. Gaius expanded these reforms, adding grain subsidies and judicial reforms, but met a similar fate in 122, killed with supporters during a violent crackdown. And so post-Gracchi legislation emerged as a reaction, often undoing or modifying the reforms to appease the elite while addressing lingering unrest. By the way, the Gracchi were not revolutionaries, as a certain classist historiography wanted to represent them. Actually, some of their laws were pretty conservative, and even more so than some that had at some point contingently been issued by the nobilitas. And trying just to, again, stem some of the effects. Some of their policies were demagogic, some were populistic, others were fine and reasonable. But reconstructing 2nd century BC Roman politics is not easy, because we do not know everything that we would like to know. So this is, generally speaking, the most so-called mainstream, I hate this term, but so to say, interpretation of the dynamic. In the years after the initial reforms, a sequence of laws permanently halted the execution of the agrarian changes established by the Gracchi. The first of these laws declared that land distributed by the triumvirs could now be sold, overturning the restriction Tiberius had put in place. So basically, there had been a college of three agricultural, agricultural triumvirate supervising the ager publicus distribution, the possible abuses stemming from that, corruption, etc. Again, the system was pretty corrupt, like all systems of the time, to the degree, of course, a contemporary state did not quite exist in the way we intended, so it worked privatistically to an important degree. And now, in an unprecedented level of wealth, that naturally favored that sort of lack of reform aimed to check this dynamics. Tiberius' original law made redistributed land inalienable to keep it with smallholders. I will not digress now on how this land was allotted, for example, or how could it be maintained for different dynamics. We will in part comment on this along the way today. The most important aspect is, however, that the post-Gracchi law, allowing sales, primarily benefited wealthy landowners and speculators. Right, these elites had the cash to buy up plots from poor recipients who, strapped for resources or pressured, often sold. This reversed the reform's intent, consolidating land back into large estates, the latifundia owned by the Roman aristocracy. As a result, numerous plots quickly changed hands. Right, certain scholars argue that this indicates that small-scale farming was no longer sustainable economically, suggesting that the Gracchi's approach relied on redistributing ager publicus in an era when Rome's economy and society had shifted from the early days of the 4th century, the 3rd century. By the late 2nd, the rise of latifundia worked by slaves from conquests outcompeted small farmers. The reforms ignored this economic reality, and the entrenched power of the Senate, which controlled land and resisted change. Politically, their use of the tribunate alienated allies and provoked violent opposition, making failure almost inevitable without broader systemic support. Still, it is worth pointing out that, per our sole source, purchasers occasionally used force to compel the land's recipients to sell. This is said by Appian in the Bellum Civile 127-121. Essentially, wealthy buyers, likely backed by private muscle or local influence, intimidated smallholders into selling. This could involve physical threats, destruction of crops, or legal harassment. And the why, of course, ties to profit. Land was cheap from desperate sellers, and elites wanted to expand estates. Appian notes this as a symptom of power imbalances. Small farmers lacked protection against the rich once legal restrictions loosened. Despite this, small landholdings persisted through every upheaval lasting well into the imperial period. Small landholdings, in fact, endured in regions like parts of Campania or Etruria, where peasant farmers clung to plots despite pressures. For instance, archaeological evidence from rural Italy shows modest farms persisting into the early empire, often on marginal land, less appealing to elites. These holdings survived through tenacity, local cooperation, or because they weren't worth seizing. In any case, when we look at this period, we should understand that even though the latifundium would become definitely the most defining form of land exploitation in the empire, and we know this well, especially on the longer run, like from a long-term perspective, the transition from essentially a tribal backbone of the Romano-Italic peoples into a more oligarchically nobiliar landholding, straddling at some point in the empire, in fact over provinces, multiple provinces at a time, could not be immediate, right? We mentioned here Etruria, for example, that was historically actually one of the most unequal lands, especially before the Roman conquest. It's true that the Romans had conquered the Etruscans, that had very few very rich people who owned all the land, and then mostly all the rest were peasants, were servants even. But these were particularly also fertile areas, and so we can't think, like in Campania, for example, that was very intensely Romanized, and in fact very close to Latium, that medium, small land holdings could simply disappear, right? Think about the least sort of appealing areas of the Apennine hinterland. Yes, they were less powerful, but at the same time, people there probably, while witnessing a rise of the aristocracy co-opted by the Romans after the conquest of these Italics, had kept living in similar ways and had possibly even increased their own individual wealth thanks to Romanization and the broader Roman expansion to which they had participated by this point in the social legions against Carthage or Macedon. So we're talking still a time in history in which Italy was overwhelmingly rich and overwhelmingly populated at the same time. So while you would see a lot of imbalance, there would be lots of exceptions to this. It's not like every Roman citizen that wasn't part of the Senate simply lived as a proletarian in conditions of quasi-serfdom/slavery. Slaves are another important topic because, as we just said, there were many, but they were also weaponized, as we've seen, by their masters against sometimes literal freemen. So what would happen again? There is the big senatorial latifundium staffed by, in fact, some freedmen that were incredibly, also for obvious, let's say, Freudian reasons, incredibly violent, vicious, and torturous individuals that would militarize the slaves and brutalize them into, also because they were very cheap at this point, there were so many, this is not like the later Roman Empire, and would simply arm these mobs to beat and expel actual Roman citizen farmers from surrounding holdings and occupying them, obviously sparking outrage. We will also have to take a very precise look at some point at the servile revolts, such as Spartacus, the Sicilian rebellions, etc. Those were quite messed up, right? We often interpret them as these were, gladiators, slaves of war. Now, there were also lots of Roman citizens. And in fact, even Spartacus' revolt, aside from the broader narrative, the romanticism of the story, basically has nothing to do with any kind of freedom. Like, if those slaves had found a new home somewhere else, they would have used slaves themselves. What is actually really interesting about that, mostly, is the fact that there were so many Roman citizens that joined the ranks of that rebellion. Not for the best reasons, by the way, because there was still an order, was maintained. There was, as we've seen, still a substantial amount of private property. The backbone of the Roman, let's say, citizen soldier had been fundamentally weakened at this point, and a new phase of Roman expansion, triggered by the Marian reforms and the rise of the great warlords through an ever more oligarchic and privatistic form of clientery redistribution with conquests abroad, would partially solve that problem. But in fact, it's a different political institutional framework. Some scholars say that there isn't even that massive difference. It's not really before the mid-1st century BC that phenomenon of the warlords, for example, would actually appear. So again, this is all very debatable. I tend to follow the sort of older, more sort of consistently confirmed kind of interpretation. Also because everything, generally speaking, fits the broader pattern. You can't really pretend that the Gracchi hadn't mirrored a broader one in Roman society, nor that basically the system did not, break down, institutionally speaking, until the mid-1st century BC. In fact, some scholars that criticize this went as far as saying, but Rome actually, it's not true that Rome didn't have manpower. It's not like they didn't have manpower during the 2nd century BC. It's that the fundamentals of, say, the social contract had been creaking, and the absence of a more solid kind of imperial government, as it would develop, in fact, only from the later Republic, did not favor a tight control and more an efficient rationalization of those resources, right? So this is incredibly important, and it also explains many aspects of Roman foreign policy, including basically the stop of major conquests, a sort of surrender of the initiative to actually weak enemies that, however, Rome had to struggle for a long time, simply because she wasn't committed enough, and in part because of this establishment that did not want to change things towards a more refined, more concentrated political direction, because they wanted to share this unprecedented level of wealth. And as we've seen, there was a very corrupt way to collective power at this point. A subsequent law, by the way, consider here we don't know precisely even the years and the authors of these laws, when they were issued, in which circumstance. We just have a broader chronological set of information we have to reconstruct and allocate. Anyway, a subsequent law terminated the redistribution of public land and disbanded the triumvirate tasked with agrarian matters. Consequently, those who, whether by luck or through relentless appeals to the consuls opposing the triumvir's decisions, had escaped having their land seized, were now guaranteed to keep indefinitely their properties they had, they or their forebears had unlawfully taken. In exchange, they had to pay a levy, the proceeds of which were intended, though the exact method remains unclear, to benefit the populace in theory, because it was public fee. In fact, this requirement wasn't entirely new, since a fee had theoretically always been owed for occupied ager publicus. Then whether it was how this was practically levied, this is another matter. In any case, the novelty may have been at this point in how the collected funds were directed, by the way. And the aforementioned people are exactly the ones who were more directly profiting. There is all a clienterly hierarchy and mechanism here, whereby you have different factions that will support one another at some point, out of status, other times just because they were interested in expanding in a certain part of the ager publicus. So it wasn't just necessarily about the top guy in the Senate, but the people who depended on him, and that he could shield depending on the circumstances. But they were often Roman senatorial class in equitas, so the knights, the elite who had illegally occupied ager publicus for generations at large. Families like the Corneli, the Aemili, or Claudi, with vast estates in Italy and beyond, benefited most, directly or indirectly. The law secured their holdings, levying a fee they could easily pay, while ending threats to their dominance posed by reformers, which had been their most important issue. Also showing how potentially successful the Gracchi reforms could have actually been, right? So they would have not simply taken out the plebeian tribunes just like that. Their power was literally entrenched to the point they saw these maneuvers as a threat to it. And this also, again, speaks volumes about the effectiveness still, by the end of the 2nd century BC, of potential reforming movement. Which also explains, again, a lot of the turmoils that would actually occur in the following generations in Roman history. Like if you look at even the same wars, not just the civil ones, but those are important as well in the sense that witness Rome ever more involved back and forth across her dominions, obviously leading to a path of further privatization and oligarchization. Well, you can't unsee how much it differed from the previous period, from the mid-2nd century BC, when essentially no upheaval in Italy had practically ever occurred since the Hannibalic invasion. Then came a third law, the only one with a confirmed date, 111 BC, which eliminated even the aforementioned levy. Appian remarks that this left the common people with nothing. This Appian, the Bellum Civile 127, 123, 124. By the way, Appian here is key, because we use them a bit as our only source, but of course it's not just the only one, but it's the most explicit about this stuff. And Appian was an Hellenic historian of the 2nd century AD. He wrote the Bellum Civile using earlier Roman sources, like lost works of Polybius or records from the Senate and Populares. Living under the empire, he had access to archives and oral traditions about the Republic's upheavals. His focus on civil strife gave him reason to study the Gracchi as a pivotal trigger for later clashes. One may suspect that Appian overstates the case. After all, despite numerous obstacles, the triumvirs, the agricultural triumvirs, had managed to allocate land across different parts of the peninsula. So, as we were saying before, they had partially changed something. It's not like everything was fully cancelled. And not every recipient was coerced into selling their holdings either. So again, the Gracchi weren't that revolutionary or, particularly counter traditional. Absolutely not. This is a classistic, structuralistic reading of the system, mostly in a socio-economical direction, and it is wrong, right? We will see better in other videos about the Gracchi how they were relatively, not just they came from the best of the Roman establishment themselves, but how there was some traditional substance to what they were doing as well. After all, again, the importance of a free Roman citizenry to stiffen the political commitment also to the military service was a particularly important topic. Could maintain a balance in the system, could help also fostering more healthy and genuine competition among the same elites. Appian's narrative sympathizes with the plebs, however. And so it comes, as we've seen, from not just 300 years later, but from a different ideological standpoint than the protagonists, say, of the same Gracchian reforms and the one of their dismantlement. Reflecting his interest in social conflict and the decline of republican equity, Appian might exaggerate the reform's erasure to underscore elite greed and the betrayal of the Gracchi's vision. Right. However, he acknowledges some land in fact stayed distributed, suggesting a nuanced view he owned himself. Still, his dramatic flair emphasizes the plebs' loss to highlight systemic failure. Naturally, we know that the Roman system had always been oligarchic in Republican times, and again, that the collapse of the lower classes wasn't quite fully there, right? Just their dependence on the elite was increasing. Naturally, the latter acquiring ever more power, no doubt. Nevertheless, at its core, Appian's assessment holds true, even at such long distance from the events that would have been, however, known and, again, documented by the contemporary historians back in the day. We can rather say that the sources Appian drew from do hold true, right? The decades that followed the dismantlement of the Gracchan legislation revealed that the ranks of the landless remained substantial in Roman society, their yearning for land still unmet. This would be still, again, an important problem. This deeply intertwines with the military, with the necessity of, for example, a clear, distinct military career available, and mostly the realization that could be the way to the land, especially, as we were saying before, through conquest. In fact, we used to say that, especially say before the Marian Reform, so to say, you would need land to go to war, to be a soldier, and after the Marian Reform, you became a soldier to get the land, right? But of course, the Romans had dramatically expanded their dominions in the previous centuries. Since the Camillian Reform, the plebs had had the chance to receive the imperium with magistracies on their own, to participate to the army fully fledged. So the Roman army had expanded to properly that level of duty and privilege that the right of bearing arms consisted of, in what had previously been essentially a feudal, oligarchic Rome, where just the patricians at least held sway as far as military matters were considered. Of course, they would have had their own plebeian support and retinue, but not with that degree of political, civic, official vest. At that point, those plebeians had fought and conquered, so that they had actually had land, they had augmented their own wealth. And this had been particularly important for the affirmation of the Roman-Italic Confederacy, had literally informed the Romans with their certainty that they were the people chosen by God to take over the world for a broader evangelical, ecumenic purpose. That same redemption in arms was what it meant to be a Roman, and so it's a deep Indo-European traditional archetype, and that was actually enacted and fulfilled by the Gospel of Rome. This is why, by the way, the nobilitas could still identify in such an important dynamic an existential threat to the same republican system, the institutions of Rome, how they had been laid, founded, and successfully developed, especially in the most successful moments of Roman history during the expansion of the 4th century, the wars against Pyrrhus, against Carthage in the 3rd, and the more recent expansions against the Macedons, the conquest of the East. Again, we already discussed this, observing the Roman incredibly rapacious mentality. The fact that this was really their own God-given right And so that if this had once worked, it had been because the system had held. If this came short of effectiveness, you could not really know who would have taken over. After all, the establishment itself was very much aware of how different the pre-Cannae and after-Cannae elite was, with the newly enriched that filled the senatorial ranks because of the losses against Hannibal in that terrible battle. The necessity of moral purity was an imperative felt by the Romans. The traditional order of the castes was still seen as essentially an immediate settlement of the various degree of individual and collective worth. So if this order existed the way it did, it's because God had sanctioned it on the basis of virtue. But this didn't mean that in absolute terms the system was, however, better than before, and that this relative internal adjustments would be actually a good measure of that change. In fact, again, especially the murder of a plebeian tribune basically meant from the elite a war declaration of what had been one of the linchpins of the republican system, which had eventually deteriorated to a dangerous point, one that some see of no return, which especially after the demise of the Gracchi, in historical hindsight, it's not even that difficult to make. This was worsened by the Roman state's willing surrender of its claims to most of the old public land, rendering any future revival of Tiberius Gracchus' strategy unfeasible. In other words, the dismantlement of the Gracchi reforms was now pushing towards a direction that was ever more difficult, virtually impossible at this point to disentrench and to prevent from sort of sliding further in that direction. This is true for the centuries to come. Again, this is not like there weren't free landowners working their fields like soldiers, people who had just also a certain degree of entrepreneurial success in the lower ranks of society. But what is important is that power becomes increasingly more oligarchic and private, so that these people often succeed because they are protected by someone and they work for him. And this does tend to bring some greater form of exploitation, but at the same time, the needs, the Marian reforms are not that far, as you understand, to unlock at least these means, this manpower, for, given the immense wealth of the oligarchs and literally the proletarian force at hand represented by the dispossessed, to further expand the res publica to essentially a private ambitions, to the warlords of the era with very distinctive political and military leadership and inclination that would be the sub for, in fact, the further Roman expansion. You can even see a degree of, if not virtues, depending on how you want to define this, but at least of logical and functional dynamism in all this. After all, the Roman military was toughening up. The Roman capacity, in fact, to expand and to bring new wealth and means to the system would go on. This would come at terrible costs and suffering, in many circumstances, but mostly because of the political instability due to the crisis of public authority, right? As it happens in other times in history, it's paradoxically through private competition that public authority can be restored, right? Because at some point you have a monarchy, right? And up to this point, the Roman establishment was not univocal, was composed by many different clans that, in fact, had all their own ambition and sort of competition, antagonism going on with one another, exactly because of all these resources that weren't simply about grabbing what could be squeezed out of this dispossessed farmers, but expand further and acquire more individual power by themselves. And still through the public offices, opportunities arising from international policy, the possibility of conquering other peoples, etc. One avenue would notoriously become the colonies, that at some point, especially in the mid-1st century BC, would be recovered. This was an important, for example, Caesarian policy, but not only, through the foundation of a provincial establishment, which had been de facto blocked, right? Think about, again, the outcome of the trial with the Scipiones. Definitely Rome was not ready for that yet, as that incident also proved. There wasn't much of a space for a tendentially monarchic and Hellenistic influence sense of imperial control and reform, so to say. But there had been figures who had resumed the colonization policy. One had been Livius Drusus, who had planned 12 new colonies to be founded. Marcus Livius Drusus, tribune in 91 BC, was a populist reformer echoing the Gracchi. He professed founding 12 colonies to settle landless Romans and ease unrest alongside citizenship for Italian allies that, as you know, in a generation or so will also rebel against Rome for earning that full citizenry that they wouldn't even overly exploit, but they had been barred from. And this definitely showing how the Roman establishment had thwarted Roman potential, had contained the system so much because they wanted just to control it by themselves and not sharing it with the establishment that would unavoidably bring Rome to re-expand and create provincial, new provincial posts that would have to be mirrored in the Senate. This would be at large Romano-Italic citizens themselves. But on the long run, as you know, the problem, even during the empire, of mostly emperors wanting to extend citizenship and the Senate being more conservative, always going in parallel, respectively, with some more successful expansion and some sort of internal stagnation based on the latifundum luxus more than else. In fact, the importance of, for example, the equites and or lower, because the equites had also tendentially very similar direction compared to the senators, but properly that legionary citizenry, right, that backbone of the local Romano-Italic farmer also abroad that had made success and you could rely on, as the masses of the legions, by the way, was always crucial for the monarchy that fully affirmed itself in the empire, right? Livius Drusus' assassination amid the social war, 91-88 BC, I made a video about the social war, by the way, halted those plans of colonization, leaving them unfulfilled promises to bolster Drusus' political base and address inequality. So that the 12 planned colonies would stay mere proposals, with possibly just one, and this is actually very uncertain, as an exception, that is Abillinum, modern Avellino in Campania, which may have been a tentative exception due to its strategic location in the mountainous hinterland and existing settlement patterns possibly linked to earlier Gracchan efforts or local needs. We're not entirely sure whether this was even the case. In fact, evidence is shaky, perhaps a misreading of Appian or later sources, but it's plausible as a site for a small unofficial colony attempt before Drusus' plans collapsed entirely. So, we have here the picture. As you understand, this cancelling was practically swift. We will see this better many times in other videos explaining this period, and we take our time to talk Roman history, but we also tend at some point to discuss it beyond our regular level of depth. Less videos, but ideally concentrating multiple times on different times, by the way, of the very long Roman history. I think that the main points here are made. There isn't too much to add. Of course, it's, as I was saying before, often a matter of interpretation, given the relative lack of precise information. Sort of like, say, Roman history, ancient history in general, relies very much on this sources interplay that can't be particularly verified as we could do for more better documented times in history. So it's interesting also to see how historiography tends to, of course, interpret Roman history in a more comprehensive fashion, because of course we're talking basically Rome per se. So it's a major power. It will remain unitary, and therefore there is a greater temptation, so to say, to make some sort of bolder, sort of more deterministic, more sort of positivistic explanation of how things actually went or not. History tells us, of course, that even big changes can be triggered by small decisions, that things depend really on the moral forces that agitate in the system itself, a reason for which it's often practically impossible to simply find an answer for such faraway times from which we are detached, if anything, because of the lack of, say, awareness of the historical feeling at the time. Over 2,400 videos I made. I can see here more than 200 videos about Roman history. I can see here this is the 215th. So I am very satisfied when I think how much there is to do, and the fact that we kept almost 1/10 of the channel revolving around Romanity in this fashion. This is indeed very important, because you can't quite simply nor bypass Roman history, nor just make the channel only about that, simply for the obvious reason that you need sort of a more comparative understanding of the various eras to fully appreciate them better. But Roman history is also very long, reason for which I want to make these videos always bear in mind that it's relatively more diluted. However, I'm glad because we managed to do an important job. All we need is to render it a bit all more familiar, especially stepping into specific topics. I think I made only one video ever about the Second Punic War, which is insane. It's not like we haven't talked about some protagonists of the same. We didn't talk about different militaries at different times overlapping with this period. But considering Roman history and considering the necessity, the fact that we have been covering also other peoples, and that's something, in fact, that I would really like to do more again. You see, the objective is really to have this enormous flow of videos that allow you to switch like from an era to another, but still land into a tapestry of videos that you can net, a web that you can sort of, it can really give the idea how that life went on across the ages, and not making just one video about this people once and this other another time far away. No, passing literally from one people to another with that level of depth that really makes you understand better about, well, it is really my dream. It's always been what all these videos have been about. By the way, just today I was checking the analytics, and it turns out that there is a very high dedication towards the channel, but that unfortunately, that in fact makes me have much more income in proportion than anyone who makes this kind of views, which makes me think that however we make still few views overall, and this makes me think that lots of people do not even know that we are out here, and this connects with the playlists thing, because it's as if many people didn't picture that these existed, right? And it's a problem indeed, because the playlists are perhaps the best indicator of the aforementioned sense of that interconnection, right? And so it's really important to talk more about those and to make people aware, because otherwise they will not flock to the channel. They will not even know we're here. Instead, we have to make everything possible to increase that. And again, I think it's really crucial at this point in the channel. So wherever you are, please share wherever you can, not just one share, one oblum, so to say. I thank you for all the way you share. I see it also on X, etc. But just like on X, until it becomes obsessive, you can't quite make it. You can't quite make the channel grow that fast after all, right? So it would be really easy if, as we all together, how many are we now? 26,000. We could share overnight, the channel will literally boom. That's literally the mold we have to break. There isn't any other obstacle. Precisely. So it would be easy to make it happen. Make especially other people know that I'm there. Show the playlists especially, because they're really, really important. And let's, I don't know, I could do more. I, for example, don't make many community posts because I don't want to annoy people. But in this sense, it's also a matter of will to power. I'm also going to make more playlists myself. I've seen that doesn't necessarily increase. I don't know how it really works, because it may get views from people who see the playlist but do not click on it, so it's complicated. I should make more thorough exams on the analytics on this, but For example, we made many videos about the 2nd century BC by now. Excuse me, I drink a little. That it's good to have that enucleated. I'm also sorry really for my voice in the last couple of days, but I got COVID, so I don't have much voice. I'm actually recording with great difficulty. I cough all the time. I cut that, but you can't hear. It's not my usual voice. So I hope that doesn't sound too bad. More like I make it like this. But it's hopefully gonna pass. By the way, tomorrow I have another interview, and actually it has indirectly to do with the channel. So I hope I will have enough voice, especially in the morning. It's rough after you slept. When you go down, you always have more problems of that sort with a cough, etc. But we'll see. I really count on you again for everything. As always, I know that you're devoted followers, and thank you for all the support. Let's get an extra gear and more, and we will surely get somewhere we didn't even imagine we could actually get to. I truly believe this. Very well. I lengthen this usually because I try to make the video 1 hour long. So the more I speak, the better it is. People tend to watch more, etc. It doesn't really cost me anything. But saying these things every once in a while is also important because it makes you aware that it's not just the story, it's also the channel at the same time. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.